How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Kuf Zayin, Daf 107 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, we continue our discussion of Shechutei, chutz, and Amayle bachutz. There are 5 sections of today's Daf. The first one is offering Shechutei chutz bachutz. Okay, we had discussed yesterday. Did we start the Mishnah yesterday? Yeah, we did. We had seen yesterday machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi Aglili about does Shechutei chutz only apply to does Amayle bachutz? Right, a refresher. What's Shechutei chutz? What's Amayle bachutz? Shechutei chutz is slaughtering a korban outside of the azar. Amayle bachutz is offering that korban on a mizbeach, on an altar outside of the azar. Now, the assumption is that if one slaughters a korban in the azara and then takes it out of the azara and offers it on an altar outside of the azara, everyone agrees that that would be a violation of hamayle bachutz, offering a korban outside of the azara. The question is, what about if the korban was slaughtered outside of the azara and then offered outside of the azara? Of course, you would be chayiv for shechutei chutz. What about hamayle bachutz? That is the first section of today's daf. What about that? How does it? So we saw yesterday it's machlokes between Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Yossi Aglili says Potter, the Tanakama says Chayiv. Why does the Tanakama says Chayiv? That is the first section of today's daf. The second section of today's daf, Zerikah bachutz. Shechutei, we're going to find it's not limited to Shechutei chutz and Amayle bachutz. There's also a Zorek bachutz. How do we learn that? Where do we learn that from? What about Kemitzah bachutz by a korban mincha? What about kabbalah sadam bachutz? Are those bachutzes that you would be chayiv for? We then define what is considered bachutz. Outside of what? At what point is it considered outside? There's going to be an interesting scenario there that we will be discussing. If it is considered outside, I will leave that as a little surprise for later. And very, very interesting, in my opinion, towards the end of the daf, we will be discussing Shechutei chutz nowadays. What about nowadays? Somebody offers a korban. Would you be chayiv for Shechutei chutz? Machlokes of Yochanan and Rish Lakish gets into the topic that is scattered throughout Shas of Kedusha Rishona, Kitchel Shaita, Kitchel Asalavu. Very, very interesting. I hope you will enjoy. You will join me and enjoy Daf Kuf Zayin of Masechta Zevachim. Let's do it. Friends, we are going to begin on Daf Kuf Zayin, 3 lines into the Daf. Ashkechon mukterei pnim she'elon bachutz. Mukterei chutz she'elon bachutz minayin. Says the Gemara, okay, so we know that if a korban was slaughtered in the azara and then taken out of the azara and offered outside of the azar, you'd be chayiv for hamayle bachutz. How do we know that? So Rashi tells us how we know that. The Rashi says, "Vel pesach oil moed lo yavienu," that the pasuk says by hamayle bachutz that vel pesach oil moed lo yavienu, you didn't bring it to offer it in the Beis Hamikdash, implying that you had the option to, but you didn't. You could have, but you didn't, and instead you offered it outside of the azar. Now, if we're talking about a korban that was slaughtered outside of the azar, there's no option to offer it on the mizbeach. It was slaughtered outside of the azar. You can't offer that on the mizbeach. So if we're talking about a korban that had the option to be offered on the mizbeach, but was then offered outside of the azara, that would be a animal that was slaughtered in the azar. So the assumption is if the animal was slaughtered in, the korban was slaughtered in the azar, then taken out of the azara and offered on an altar outside of the azara, so everyone agrees, and we saw in the Mishnah yesterday, Yossi Aglili agrees, everyone agrees that would be hamayle bachutz, you would be in violation of hamayle bachutz. The question is, what about shechutei chutz? If a korban was slaughtered outside of the azara and then was offered outside of the azara, so of course you would be chayiv for shechutei chutz, for slaughtering outside of the azara, but when you then offer that korban outside of the azara, hamayle bachutz, would you be chayiv for that as well? So now, Rabbi Yossi Aglili had said, no, you would not. The Tanakama says, yes, you would. So, the question is, where does the Tanakama get that from? Why would you be chayiv? Ashcha mukterei pnim she'elon bachutz. Okay, so we know that korbanos that were slaughtered inside of the azara, muktare, that they would be able to be burnt, that they would be able to be offered inside of the azara. If they are offered instead outside of the azara, you're chayiv for amayla bachutz. Muktare chutz. What about korbanos that were slaughtered and were then going to be burnt outside of the azara, and they're unable to be burnt in the azara? That's what we're referring to that as muktare chutz, slaughtered outside of the kilo. Basically, shechutei chutz we're referring to as muktare chutz, that they were slaughtered outside of the azara. Shehelon bachutz, that you then were maila them bachutz. Minayin, how do you know that you're chayiv for that? How do you know that if you slaughter a korban outside of the azara and then offer it outside of the azara, you're going to be chayiv not just for shechutei chutz but also for hamayla bachutz? So we're going to see three suggestions. Amar Rav Kahana says, Amar Kol, the pasuk says, Va'aleim Tomer. Very, very interesting. So, Rav Kahana has an interesting shita. His interesting shita is that, if you remember yesterday, we read the psukim. Yesterday we opened up a chumash, like we've done a few times recently. It's very interesting that's been something that we can do with Zevachim, with some of these sugis that we've been learning. Pasha, just open up a chumash and read the psukim to get some context, which is what we did yesterday. We saw those psukim. Perek Yud Zayin of Sefer Vayikra opens up, and the first 7 psukim of Perek Yud Zayin of Sefer Vayikra to discuss Ashoichet bachutz, slaughtering a korban outside of the azara. Now there, I just want to read you a pasuk from there. It said, Daber laharon, speak to Aaron, Velbanov and his sons, Velkol b'nei Yisrael, all of Israel, V'marta aleihem, speak to them. And then it described Shechutei chutz. And then psukim ches and tes, psukim 8 and 9 of Perek Yud Zayin of Sefer Vayikra. So that psukim ches and tes discuss amayla b'chutz. Pasuk ches says, Va'aleim tomar. So if Kahana understands Va'aleim Tomar as meaning, and about them, say that there's also halacha of an Isra of Amayla bachutz. Meaning, we just had 7 psukim talking about Shechutei chutz, and about them, about what you've just slaughtered outside of the Azara, Hamayla bachutz, if you are then Maila it, you are going to be chayiv. So if Kahana wants to learn from there, from the Va'aleim Tomar, and about them, now say over the halacha, the Isra of Amayla bachutz, meaning that Amayla b'chutz even applies to something that was also slaughtered, Shechutei chutz, that was slaughtered outside of the azar. So you could slaughter it outside of the azar, be chayiv for Shechutei chutz, and then be mailet outside of the azar, be chayiv for Amayla b'chutz. So Amar of Kahana says of Kahana, Amar Kol, the pasuk says, Va'aleim Tomar, Al Asmuchin Tomar, or there's a different verse that says, Al Rishonim Tomar. So Kila Va'aleim Tomar, and about those, about them, about the thing, about the psukim just prior, i.e. Shechutei chutz, say that if you then offer it bachutz, you're going to be chayiv for amayla bachutz tomar. So then al smuchim tomar, then you'll be chayiv for amayla bachutz. That's how you know that if you are shochet bachutz, you will also then be chayiv for amayla bachutz if you are in fact mayla bachutz. Maskif lo Rave, but Rave asks a gevaldige kasha on Rav Kahana, and the question is, miksiv va'aleim with it the letter ayin? No, it does not. Va'aleim ksiv with the letter aleph. It says Va'aleh with the letter Aleph, and as we read the second pasuk of Perek Yud Zayin of Sefer Vayikra, I'll read it again. Daber laharon velbanov velkol b'nei Yisrael v'amarta aleihem, and say to them. Well, the same lashon you have in pasuk Ches when it says Va'aleim tomar, and to them say, just like in pasuk Beis we said say to them, to b'nei Yisrael. So also pasuk Ches when it says Va'aleim tomar, and also to them say. It doesn't mean Aleim with an ayin, referring to the psukim beforehand, right? I.e., Shechutei chutz. No, it says Va'aleim, to them, to the same people that we were talking to before. Tell them about the Isra of Amayla b'chutz as well, but it does not. It's Rava says Aleim Tomar is not a reference to Shechutei chutz. Elo ki the Tana Devei Rabbi Yishmael. Rather, I assume that this is Rava suggesting, like the Tana Devei Rabbi Yishmael. Va'aleim Tomar, that when it says Va'aleim Tomar with the Vav, so Vav Mosif al Inin Arishin, that the letter Vav serves to say and also to join the previous psukim with these psukim, and also to them say, to add on, le'ari parshas, to make it all one big happy parsha, and to say that also the animal that was shchutei bachutz in the first part, if you are then maileit bachutz, it's all the same, it goes smoothly one to the next, and you would go from one isser to the next isser. And if you slaughter a korban bachutz and then are maileit bachutz, we're saying that you'd be chayiv for hamaila bachutz. If you take that animal that you were just shochet bachutz, and you would then maileit bachutz, you would be chayiv for hamaila bachutz, i.e., you would be chayiv two separate isurim. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan has an interesting opinion, particularly because of the ramifications of it that we will see. Rabbi Yochanan Omer Atse Avoya Avoya Malaholan Mukterei Chutz Afkan Mukterei Chutz. Rabbi Yochanan is an interesting shita. If you remember from yesterday, friends, at the end of the daf yesterday got a little bit misubach towards the end with the kal v'chomer stuff. But anyways, ultimately, at the end of the daf yesterday, we answered the question that we had, which was, where's the warning for Shechutei chutz? That was our question. Where's the warning for Shechutei chutz? Where's the warning for Shechutei chutz? Because by Shechutei chutz and by Amayla bachutz, the pasuk Torah says there's a chiyuv kares. Now by Amayla bachutz, it said that if you do it, you chayiv kares. And there was another pasuk that said Hishamer l'cha pen tailo l'sechel. It's a pasuk from Sefer Devarim. Make sure not to be Maila bachutz. So there's a warning. There's a lav. Don't do it. So there's a warning. There's a punishment. That's by a Maila bachutz. But we don't see such a warning by Ashoichet bachutz. So the question is, while we see the punishment for Ashoichet bachutz, chiyuv kares, we don't find anywhere a warning. How do we know that there's a warning for Ashoichet bachutz? In order to be chiyuv kares, there would have to be a warning. So the Gemara answers, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that it is a gzeir shava. It's a gzeir shava. It says by hashoichet bachutz. It says vel pesach hamoed lo hevio. By maile bachutz it says vel pesach hamoed lo yivienu. Hevio, yivienu. Right, both different forms of the word hava'a, bringing. So Rabbi Yochanan learned yesterday gzeir shava. It says hava'a by a maile bachutz. It says hava'a by Shechutei chutz, just like by a maile bachutz, a yochayiv kares, and there's also a warning. So also by the gzeir shava, by Shechutei chutz, there's a chiyuv kares, and also there is a warning. We can treat it as though there is a warning by Shechutei chutz as well. What's important about that is that that's how we learned out two different chiyuvim, two different isers that two different chiyuvei kareses. To the extent that, as we're going to see in a minute, and I'm kind of giving away the question on his sheet over here, but as we're going to see in a minute, there's a Mishnah, the first Mishnah in Masechta Kresus, which talks about kares. In the first Mishnah of Masechta Kresus, it lists 36 things that they could be chayiv kares for, and two of the items on that list, two separate items on that list. One is Shechutei chutz, the other one is Amayla bachutz. Hashoichet v'Amayla bachutz, says the Mishnah in Kresus. So meaning, so strong is that Gezeir Shava, is that because of that Gezeir Shava, we could treat Hashoichet bachutz and Amayla bachutz as two separate lavin that you'd be chayiv kares for, and they are counted as their own individual lavin in the Mishnah in Kresus. So now Rabbi Yochanan wants to say the same thing over here and say, well, we have Gezeir Shava. It says Avah by Hashoichet bachutz. It says Avah by Amayla bachutz, and therefore, just like by Hashoichet bachutz, Hashoichet bachutz is being slaughtered obviously outside of the azar. So also Amayla bachutz applies to an animal that was slaughtered outside of the azar, not just an animal that was slaughtered inside of the azar. But now the Gemara asks, just like as we described, well, if based on the fact that there's a gezeira shava of hava, that it says yivienu by Amayla bachutz and hevio, I believe, by Hashoichet bachutz, we said those are two separate chiyuvei kares, and therefore in the Mishnah Masechta Me'ilah they are listed separately. Well, then if we're using this Gezeir Shava to learn out another item, which is that also not just Hamayla bachutz a korban that was slaughtered in the Azara, but also a Maila bachutz via the Gzeir Shava applies to a korban that was slaughtered outside of the Azara. So there should be 3 items in the Mishnah in Masechta Kresos. There should be Hashoichet bachutz, there should be Hamaila bachutz, that which was slaughtered in the Azara, and Hamaila bachutz, that which was slaughtered outside of the Azara. So there should be 37 things that you chayiv kares for in the Mishnah in Kresos, but it only lists 36. So that's a question that we have in Rabbi Yochanan, right? So says Rabbi Yochanan Amar Asya Havaya, that we have a Gzeir Shava between Ashoichet bachutz and Amayla bachutz Malahol, and just like by Ashoichet bachutz Mukterei chutz, obviously the animal is being slaughtered outside of the Azar. So can also by Amayla bachutz Mukterei chutz. So then Amayla bachutz would apply also to an animal that was slaughtered outside of the Azar. That is how Rabbi Yochanan learns out this halacha. Now, Maskiv Rabbi asks, Haditnan, that which we learn in a Mishnah, in the first Mishnah in Kresos, Shloshim V'Sheish Kresos Batera, that there are 36 Kresoses in the Torah. 2 of those 36 are Hashoichet bachutz and Amayla bachutz. But Tzlasim V'Sheva Avyon, really there should be 37 because we should divide Amayla bachutz into 2. Amayla bachutz, an animal that was slaughtered inside the Azara, and Amayla bachutz, an animal that was slaughtered outside of the Azara. So there should really be 37. De'ika Amayla V'Amayla, right? Because there's 2 types of Amayla bachutz. Kasha, the Gemara says, it's taka, a valid kasha on the opinion of Reb Yochanan. And now we are moving on to the topic of Hazorek bachutz. We are going to learn now that Zerikah, that Shechutei chutz and Amayla bachutz are not limited to those 2 things, but also Zerikas hadam bachutz is something that you would be chayiv for as well. V'aditnan, that which we learn in a Mishnah. This Mishnah is going to be on Daf Kuf Yud. In another few days, we're going to learn the following Mishnah: Zorek miktsas domim bachutz chayiv. We're going to learn that one who does a partial zrikas adam bachutz, right? So if somebody slaughters a korban outside of the Azara and then does just one zrika on the mizbeach, not shtaim shenarba or anything, just one zrika, chayiv. That's what we're going to learn in the Mishnah. Now, Minolan, how do we know bichlal that Zerikah bachutz is even chayiv, right? We learned the psukim. We read the psukim in the Chumash. The psukim talk about Ashoichet bachutz, Amayla bachutz. Doesn't say anything about Hazorek bachutz, at least not obviously. So we're going to see now a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva about where we learn the prohibition of Hazorek bachutz from. Nafka, so Minolan, I don't know, Minolan Nafkale, I feel like it's Minolan question mark, Nafkale Midatanya. We learn it out from the following part. So Dam Yechoshev l'Rabbas Hazorek Divrei Yishmael. Rabbi Shmuel says, look, when the pasuk says by Shechutei chutz, it says Dam Yechoshev la'isha hu dam shafach. So I think really technically it's being learned out from dam shafach, right? That the pasuk says that if you are shochet bachutz, it's considered like dam shafach, like you spilled blood, and spilling blood is like zurikas adam. So it says Rabbi Yishmael that from dam shafach we learn out that hazorek bachutz you're also chayiv for. Now, however, even though I think technically it's really learned out from dam shafach, the Gemara seems to be referring to it as dam yechashev. So I will, just to be consistent with the Gemara, I'll refer to it as dam yechashev. It says dam yechashev leish o dam shafach. Technically, I think the proof is from dam shafach. The Gemara is talking about dam yechashev, so I will refer to dam yechashev from this point on. At least that's my plan. So l'Rabbi hazorek divrei Rabbi Shmuel. So from dam yechashev, we learn out hazorek bachutz is chayiv. Rabbi Kiva Omer, Zavach l'Rabbi says hazorek. Rabbi Kiva says that the pasuk by Amayla bachutz says, V'aleim Tomer, I'm reading the pasuk, Ish ish mi beis Yisrael min hager, asher yoga b'sochem, asher yale ola o zavach. So the o comes to include zrikas adam bachutz as well. So Rabbi Kiva Omer, zavach l'Rabbi es hazorek. Rabbi Shmuel, Hi ozavach, my avilei. Okay, so now basically almost until the end of the Amud, we're going to be having this ping pong. Rabbi Shmuel learned it out from Dam Yechoshev. Rabbi Kiva learned it out from O Zavach. And now it's just going to be Nus, Rabbi Shmuel, what do you do with O Zavach? And then he's going to say, oh, I use it for this. Okay, Rabbi Kiva, then where do you learn what he learns from? And then, okay, then Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Kiva just quoted a pasuk for something else. What do you do with that? It's going to be a lot of, so how do you learn out? How do you learn out? So Rabbi Shmuel, hi Zavach, O Zavach, my overlays, no. So Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Kiva had learned out from O Zavach to include Azorik bachutz. What do you learn out from O Zavach, Rabbi Shmuel? L'chalik. To say that it's not, that the pasuk is not saying that to be chayav for a maila bachutz, you'd have to be maila in Ola and a shlomim. I imagine Zavach could be any kind of, well, what can you even offer outside? You can't, maybe you're kind of only limited to in Ola and a shlomim. What else can you offer outside? And maybe like a bechor or something like that. I don't know. Rashi uses a shlomim as an example, so I'll use that. Right? So when it says, so I might think that you'd only be chayv for a maila b'chutz. To be chayv, you'd have to offer both an ola and a shlomim. So it says ola, o zavach, to say, no, it's either or. Even if you only offer a shlomim or only offer an ola, you would be chayv for that. Rabbi Kiva, l'chalik minale. Okay, fair enough. Rabbi Kiva, how do you know that it's not both? Nafkale mi lo yivi enu. The pasuk says by hamayla bachutz, it says lo yivi enu. Lo yivi enu is singular. So therefore, we're not talking about multiple korbanos who'd even be chayiv for being maile, just an ola or just a shlom. Yishmael ahumi ba'alei, what Rabbi Shmuel learns out from lo yivi enu is that ala shalem muchayiv enu chayiv ala choser. You only chayiv if you offer a full, right, a lo yivi enu, a complete it, not a partial it. And therefore, you only be chayiv for a maile bachutz for a complete animal, not for a partial animal. Rabbi Kiva nafkalei, how does Rabbi Kiva know that you only chayiv for a complete animal? The answer is milasos oso. This pasuk is by. Oh, they're both by. Oh, that makes sense. Okay, yivienu lasos. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, they're both in the same pasuk by maila b'chutz. Okay, so maila b'chutz it says lo yivienu, which we said was singular, but also lasos oso. Right, right. Lo yivienu lasos oso. So lasos oso also means a complete animal, not a partial animal. Rabbi Shmuel, chad lemukterei pnim shechasu ve'elan b'chutz, v'chad lemukterei chutz shechasu ve'elan b'chutz. So Rabbi Shmuel says fair enough. Rabbi Shmuel says fair enough. It says lo yivianu, and it says lasos oso. So Rabbi Shmuel says yeah, because that teaches two things: both that if you're maila a korban that was slaughtered outside of the azar, as well as if you're maila a korban that was slaughtered in the azar. In both cases, you'd only be chayiv for a complete animal, not for a partial animal. So we had two psukim, lo yivienu, as well as lasos oso, to teach that the animal it has to be a complete animal. And says Rabbi Shmuel in two different contexts. One is for an animal that was slaughtered outside the azar. The other is for an animal that was slaughtered in the azar. Why do I need a special pasuk for an animal slaughtered in the azar? The answer is because, I believe we've learned in the past, that if a limb from an animal that is being burnt goes flying off of the altar, you'd have to put it back, I think, until it's basically consumed. Oh, and I think it was also right. It was a whole machlokas. Was it before chatzos, after chatzos? Anyways, so even partially burning an animal is significant in the azar. So I may have thought that you'd be chayiv. So an animal that was slaughtered in the azar, you'd be chayiv for shechutei. You'd be chayiv for a maila b'chutz, even for a partial animal. So therefore, Rabbi Shmuel says I need both lo yivienu and lasos oso to teach that the animal need for hamayla b'chutz, we're talking about a full animal, whether we're talking about if it was slaughtered outside the azar or in the azar. And similarly, we have a brisa that teaches, Rabbi Shmuel Omer says, Rabbi Shmuel, Yachol mukterei pnim shechasru ve'elu b'chutz chayiv. Is it possible that if you have a korban that was slaughtered in the azar and was partially offered outside of the azara, that you would be chayiv for that. Tamalom lasos oso halashalom chayiv eno chayiv ala chaser. Says lasos oso, you're only chayiv for a complete animal, not for part of an animal. Rabbi Akiva, who learns out from the asos oso that it needs to be a complete animal, and from Yivienu we learned out that it could even be one animal. It doesn't need to be an ola and a shlomim. So he actually holds muktrei pnim shechasu ve'elon bachutz chayiv. So Rabbi Akiva actually holds, like the Havamina, that an animal that was slaughtered in the Azara, and then was an animal that was slaughtered in the Azara and was offered partially outside of the Azara, you would be chayiv for a ma'ila b'chutz, just like in the Azara, right? We said if a limb falls off the pyre, you would return it, and therefore partial burning is important, is significant in the Azar. So also partial burning for an animal that was slaughtered in the Azar is important outside of the Azar as well for a ma'ile bachutz. And so therefore Rabbi Akiva learns out from La'asos Oso that an animal that was slaughtered outside of the Azar needs to be burnt completely, needs to be burnt in full outside of the Azar. If we're talking about a ma'ile bachutz for an animal that was slaughtered outside the Azar, but for an animal slaughtered in the Azar, even partially burning would be, you'd be chayiv for that. Okay, so that was an exploration of Ozava, right? We said Reb Yishmael, who learns out from Dam Yechoshev that Hazorik Bachutz is chayiv. So what does he do with Rabbi Akiva's Ozavach? And we went through a whole rabbit hole of who's learning from what psukim. Now we're going to do the second side, the flip side, the second side of the rabbit hole, the second hole of the rabbit. That sounds weird. Okay. Okay, let's go weiter. So, and that is Rabbi Akiva Muktre Pnim. Where am I? No, Rabbi Akiva. Hi, Dam Yechoshev my Ovidle. Now, Rabbi Akiva, what does he do with Reb Yishmael's pasuk? Rabbi Yishmael learned from Dam Yechoshev to Rabbi Akiva learned from Rabbi Yishmael learned from Dam Yechoshev. Dam Yechoshev, Dam Shafach, really, that Hazorik Bachutz is chayiv. So what does Rabbi Akiva learn out from Dam Yechoshev? So the rabbis shchita sa'of. Rabbi Akiva says that you're chayiv for Shechutei chutz also by birds. If you offer a bird, right? So if a bird was meant to be offered as a korban in the azar, and instead you offered it outside of the azar, so you'd be chayiv for that as well. To include birds in Shechutei chutz. Reb Yishmael, how does Reb Yishmael therefore know to include birds? Nafkalei mi o asher yishchat. That if you remember, in the pasuk that I read yesterday, actually I got caught up for a second. I was like, wait a second, this is a funny pasuk, right? It says ish. I'm reading the pasuk in Beis Yisrael. Asher yishchat shor kesav eis ba machne, in the camp. Or asher yishchat michutz lamachne, or outside the camp. It's like, what exactly was that talking about? So actually on Kuv Zayin Amud Beis, and soon we're going to discuss why the pasuk is a little bit confusing. Why is it talking about ba machne, michutz lamachne? But it also mentioned the pasuk asher yishchat twice, right? It says each asher yishchat shor kesav eis ba machne. It could have just said o michutz lamachne, but it doesn't say. It says o asher yishchat michutz lamachne. It says asher yishchat twice. Why the extra time? So Rabbi Shmuel learns out from the extra asher yishchat. He learns out that it even comes to include slaughtering birds. Shechutei chutz. The birds apply to Shechutei chutz, applies to birds as well. Rabbi Akiva Amalach. Rabbi Akiva says to you, Hahumi baile ala sheichud chayiv v'lo ala molik. Rabbi Akiva learns out from o asher yishchat that you're only chayiv for shchita of a bird, not malika. If you do malika of a bird outside of the azar, you're going to be pater for that. Rabbi Shmuel nafkalei mi ze hadavar. Rabbi Shmuel excludes milika from ze hadavar, the tanya that we learned in the Brisa asher yishchot, that when it says slaughtering ein ela shochet behema, all I know is if you slaughter an animal outside of the azar, shachat of minolan. How do I know to include that Shechutei chutz applies to birds as well? Tam lomer o asher yishchat. There's that extra o asher yishchat to include birds according to Rabbi Shmuel. Yachol af hamolek. Is it possible that even malika you'd be chayiv for v'dinu? And I can make the following argument: Mashchita de ein derech echshera bifnim chayiv. If when it comes to shchita, when it comes to a korban in the azara, you can't do shchita in the azara. you have to do malika, and yet when it comes to if slaughtering this bird outside of the azar by shchutei chutz, you would be chayiv for shchutei chutz by shchita. So malika shederech hechsher b'fnim eno din shu chayiv. So I would think that if you kill the bird in the way that you would normally kill the bird as a korban in the azar, i.e. b'malika, I would think that you would be chayiv for shchutei chutz. So Talmud Omer zeh hadavar, it says no, this is the davar, and immediately it says after that it starts talking about Ashochet bachutz, i.e., that you from Zeh Adavar, Rabbi Shmuel learns out that Shechutei chutz by a bird excludes malika. It has to dafka be shchita. Rabbi Kiva Amalach how mibayil exer shava. Rabbi Kiva says, look, there's actually exer shava that we use Zeh Adavar for exer shava in Bava Basra and in Nidarim for kind of an unrelated exer shava to include, right? Because it says. So just it's a different Gezerah. It says just like there is Aharon Banav Kol Yisrael, so that was separate Zeh Shava. So Rabbi Kiva says Zeh Davar is available for Xer Shava. It's not needed to teach me to exclude Malika. Azoi Givaldig. Okay, so we just saw a machloikes between Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Shmuel for how we know that Zerikah sadam bachutz is something that you will also be chayiv for. We saw machlokas between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva about where exactly that halacha is learned from. And now for the next section of the daf, we will shift our focus to Kemitzah and kabbalah sadam bachutz. Will you be chayiv for being kometz a korban mincha bachutz? Taking a fistful of a korban mincha bachutz, or doing kabbalah sadam bachutz, right? We saw that shchita yechayv bachutz, Zerikah yechayv bachutz, ha'alah being makter, burning a korban on the mizbeach bachutz. What about kabbalah sadam bachutz? So v'aditnan, we learn in a Mishnah, and Daf Kuf Yud Beis, we will learn in a Mishnah. This is all just coming up within the next few days. We talked about a Mishnah and Daf Kuf Yud. We're talking about a Mishnah and Daf Kuf Yud Beis. But that which we learn in the Mishnah, kometz v'makabel dam bachutz potter. So the Mishnah Taka says that for Kemitzah bachutz, taking a fistful of a korban mincha bachutz, or doing kabbalah sadam of a korban bachutz, these are things that you'd be potter for minolan. How do we know that you are potter for them? So, Gemara, 1 second. Before you start telling me how do we know they're potter, generally we say innocent until proven guilty. What's the havamina to say that you should be chayiv? Right? The burden of proof is not to say how do you know you're potter for kabbalah sadam bachutz. First of all, tell me why you should be chayiv for kabbalah sadam bachutz, and then we could talk about why you should be potter and not chayiv instead. So what's the havamina to say that you should be chayiv for kabbalah sadam bachutz, for Kemitzah samincha by chutz? So meicha teisi the chayiv teisi mishchita. So the Gemara suggests, well, amem matzinu. Let's say, well, you're chayiv for shchita bachutz. Shchita is a avoda that you do with korbanos, you slaughter it. We also talked about Zerikah, right? Oh, we'll get to Zerikah in a second. But shchita is an avoda that you're chayiv bachutz. So kabbalah sadam, Kemitzah samincha, these are also avodas. You should be chayiv for them bachutz as well. That's the havamina, says the Gemara. But no, that's not a valid havamina, because mal shchita shekain nifseles shelo la'ochlin bepesach. Shchita is more stringent. Shchita is unique in that there's a halacha by shchita that by korban pesach, if you slaughter a korban pesach with the intention of slaughtering it for people who are unable to eat it, either because they're sick or they're too old to eat it. So, right, there's zaken or chole. So if you slaughter the korban pesach for these people, so the korban pesach is invalid. So there's that, and that doesn't apply to kabbalah sadam or Kemitzah samincha. So because shchita has this kind of unique halacha to it, Kemitzah and kabbalah are unlearnable from shchita. Teisim is Zerikah. Okay, so let's move on to Zerikah. If you're chayiv for Zerikah sadam bachutz, that's just another avoda. Why should it be chayiv for Zerikah sadam bachutz, but not kabbalah sadam bachutz? No, if you're chayiv for Zerikah sadam bachutz, be chayiv also for kabbalah sadam bachutz. No, simple as that. There's a difference. Zerikah sadam is stringent in that a zar, a non-kohen who does Zerikah Sadam is taka chayiv misa. Masha'ein kain by kabbalah Sadam and by Kemitzah, by Azar. Azar, of course, is allowed to do Shechita. Azar is not allowed to do kabbalah Sadam. Azar is not allowed to do Kemitzah Samincha. Azar is also not allowed to do Zerikah Sadam. The only difference is, for doing Zerikah Sadam, Azar is going to be chayiv misa. How come? Because he's chayiv misa for a complete avoda. An avoda that doesn't have any other avodas after it, meaning, when you do kabbalah Sadam, you still have to do holacha Sadam and Zerikah Sadam. Once you've done Zerikah Sadam, in terms of the blood work, in terms of the avoda Sadam, there's no more blood work to be done. You did kabbalah Sadam, adosha Sadam, Zerikah Sadam, that's done, because that's done. If you do Zerikah Sadam, if Azar does Zerikah Sadam, is going to be chayiv misa. Kemitzah also is not complete, right? You take the kometz, you then have to burn it on the mizbech. So because by Zerikah Sadam, it's more stringent in that a Zar who does Zerikah Sadam is chayiv misa, you can't learn out kabbalah Sadam and Kemitzah Samincha from Zerikah Sadam. Teisi mi benaya. Okay, but learn out from Atzad HaShovet. We tried to learn out from Shochet. We said, no, you can't learn it from Shochet because of the halacha by Korban Pesach. You can't learn out, so let's learn it from Zerikah Sadam. You can't learn out Zerikah Sadam because of the halacha of Zar who does Zerikah Sadam is chayiv misa. Atzad HaShovet Shaboim. They're both avodas that are done by Korbanis. And if you do these avodas outside of the Azar, you're chayiv. So therefore, you should also be chayiv for if you do another type of avoda outside of the Azar. Kabbalah Sadam, Kemitzah Samincha. So the Gemara says, well, I'll tell you why. The thing is, the Gemara says, the thing is, if that was a valid approach to learn out different avodas from Atzad HaShaveh, to say that, well, you should be chayiv for kabbalah Sadam bachutz, because, well, if you're chayiv for Shechita and you're chayiv for Zerikah, why not also be chayiv for kabbalah? The thing is, if that was the case, then we shouldn't have. We saw machlokas between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva. How do we know that you're chayiv for Zerikah Sadam bachutz? Rabbi Shmuel learned it out from the pasuk of Dam Yechoshev. Rabbi Kiva learned it out from the pasuk of O Zevach. Right? We see the Torah itself. There are psukim that are teaching us that you're chayiv for Zerikah Sadam bachutz. But if there would be a valid approach to just learn out from the Tzad HaShaveh, we shouldn't have a pasuk for Zerikah Sadam, and instead say, well, you're chayiv for Shechita bachutz, you're chayiv for Amayla bachutz. So we're saying just like those are avodas by korbanos that you are chayiv for when you do them bachutz, so you should also be chayiv for Zerikah bachutz. As simple as that. But no, the Torah wrote in the Torah that you chayiv for Zerikah Sadam bachutz. How come? To say that specifically Zerikah Sadam bachutz, don't learn out kabbalah and Kemitzah, don't learn out other avodos through Atzad HaShaveh, because if it was as simple as learning out other avodas through Atzad HaShaveh, then the Torah wouldn't have at least, referenced Zerikah Sadam. It would have just allowed us to learn out Zerikah Sadam from Atzad HaShaveh, and we would also then be able to learn kabbalah Sadam and Kemitzah Amincha. But the Torah explicitly wrote that you're chayiv for Zerikah Sadam to say that you're chayiv for Zerikah, in addition to Shechutei chutz and Amayla bachutz, you're chayiv for Zerikah Sadam, but that's it. Don't learn out kabbalah Sadam and Kemitzah Samincha through Atzad HaShaveh. Now Rashi has a different girsa. I mean, there's who quotes this? The Shita Mechubetzes has a different girsa over here, which I'm going to read. So for the next 3 or 4 lines or so, I'm going to be reading a different text than is available in the Gemara. If you have access on your page of the Gemara to Shita Mechubetzes, follow along. It's not hard. I'm just reading what I just said, but it's just a different girsa. This is the girsa that Rashi had. This is why the pasuk specifically wrote about Zerikah Sadam, v'lo asimi benaya, and didn't learn Zerikah Sadam from simply a Tzad HaShaveh. Lemeimar, to say that afagav da asimi benaya, even though you could have learned out Zerikah Sadam from Shechita and Hamayla b'chutz through a Tzad HaShaveh, that's just like their avodas that you're chayiv for, so you're also chayiv for Zerikah Sadam as an avoda. However, lo teisi mi benaya, the pasuk specifically told us to learn out Zerikah Sadam to say we don't want you learning out these things through a Tzad HaShaveh. Only that which is specific in the Torah is what you're going to be chayiv for bachutz. And therefore, to answer our question of will you be chayiv for kabbalah Sadam bachutz and Kemitzah Samincha bachutz, the answer is you will not. Says the Gemara, Amar Babble, says Babble, Shachat v'Zorak. This is arguably interesting. if one does shchita bachutz and zrika bachutz. So interestingly, Rabbi Yishmael had learned out, right? Of course, again, we had read the psukim yesterday. At the beginning of Perek Yud Zayin of Sefer Vayikra, the first 7 psukim talk about Ashochet bachutz. The next 2 psukim Ches and Tes, talk about Hamayla bachutz. Now, Rabbi Shmuel had argued that within the psukim of Ashochet bachutz, there's Dam Yechoshev, from which we learn out Zerikah bachutz. Rabbi Akiva had said that within the psukim of Hamayla bachutz, it says O Zavach, from which we learn out Hazorik bachutz. So therefore, you can argue that Hazorik bachutz, according to Rabbi Shmuel, is a child, so to speak, of Ashochet bachutz, and according to Rabbi Akiva, Hazorik bachutz is a child, so to speak, of Hamayla bachutz. And therefore, what if a person is Shochet bachutz and Zorek bachutz? So we're saying, well, according to Rabbi Yishmael, they're basically both instances of Hashochet bachutz, so you'd be chayiv once. According to Rabbi Akiva, Hashochet bachutz is Hashochet bachutz, but Hazorik bachutz is kind of a child of Hamayla bachutz, so you basically have Hashochet bachutz and Hamayla bachutz, so you'd be chayiv twice. Okay, let's read it inside. Amar Babble says, Babble, Shachat v'Zorak, if a person was Shochet bachutz and Zorik bachutz, the divrei Rabbi Shmuel chayiv achas. According to Rabbi Shmuel, you'd be chayiv once, because Hazorik bachutz is, I'm going to call it a child, just as a way of referencing it. Is it technically a child of Vlad? I feel like these are kind of loaded words, the reminiscent of Shabbos, Avos, and Tolados. I'm not getting into it to that extent, just a way to associate Zerikah Sadam with either Ashochet bachutz or Hamayla bachutz. So according to Rabbi Shmuel, Hazorik bachutz is a child of Ashochet bachutz. Hazorik bachutz is a child of Ashochet bachutz. Therefore, if you're Shochet and Zorik bachutz, you're chayiv once, because they're both basically the same category. The divrei Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, chayiv shtayim, you'd be chayiv twice, because Hashochet is Ashochet bachutz, and Hazorik is really category under the Hamayla bachutz category, so therefore you'd be chayiv twice. Abaye has an interesting approach here, which is, I feel the divrei Rabbi Akiva enu chayiv ela achas, even according to Rabbi Akiva, who learns out Hazorik bachutz technically from Hamayla bachutz, he would still say you'd be chayiv once, because the Amar Sham Taisa. If you look at the pasuk says, right? The pasuk says in Devarim, Perek Yud Beis pasuk. I'm going to read pasuk Yud Gimel first, which is Hisham l'cha pentayla l'secha b'chol makom asher. Right? That is Hamayla bachutz. And the very next pasuk says, Ki im b'makom asher yivchar Hashem. You have to go to the Beis Hamikdash. Be'achad shvatecha sham taile. So that's Hamayla b'chutz o l'secha. V'sham taise. It doesn't say Hamayla and v'sham tishchat. It says v'sham taise. Basically, there's Hamayla b'chutz, says Abaye, and there's everything else. The pasuk kind of puts v'sham taile, puts Hamayla b'chutz in its own category, and then it's v'sham taise, and everything. Then there's everything else. So according to Abaye, even according to Rabbi Akiva, who learns out Hazorik bachutz from O Zavach, which is a pasuk by Hamayla bachutz, still the fact of the matter is, there's the Torah makes clear, according to Abaye, that there's Hamayla bachutz and there's everything else, and therefore if you do Hashochet bachutz and Hazorik bachutz, even according to Rabbi Akiva, you'd still only be chayiv once. Right, so Abaye Omer says, Abaye, I feel the Rabbi Akiva, even according to Rabbi Akiva, enu chayiv ela achas, you don't be chayiv once for Hashochet and Hazorik, because the Merkah Sham Taise, that meaning Sham Taile, and also everything else would just be categorized under Visham Taise. Akasav Asal and the Chulon, Avoda Achas, everything other than Hamayla is all just the same Avoda. Zarak Vehela, if you did Zerikah bachutz and Hamayla bachutz, so according to Rabbi Shmuel, you would be chayiv twice, because Zerikah is a child of Hashochet bachutz, and Hamayla is Hamayla. So the divrei Rabbi Shmuel chayiv shtayim, be chayiv twice. The divrei Rabbi Akiva, who says that Hazorik bachutz is a child of Hamayla bachutz, so Hazorik and Hamayla you'd only be chayiv once. It's the same category. Enu chayiv ela achas, Abaye Omar, but of course says Abaye, afilu divrei Rabbi Akiva chayiv shtayim. Even according to Rabbi Akiva, you would be chayiv twice again, because the La'achi palginu kra sham taile v'sham taise, as we learned earlier, that just a minute ago, that's why the pasuk divided up v'sham taile and v'sham taise, to say that Hamayla b'chutz is in its own category. There's Hamayla b'chutz and there's everything else, and therefore even according to Rabbi Akiva, when it comes to Hazorik and Hamayla b'chutz, you'd be chayiv for Hamayla and you'd be chayiv for Hazorik as it falls onto the category of everything else. If, however, a person did Shechutei and Zerikah and Amayla bachutz, all three, everyone agrees, whether you're the Tanakama, whether you're Abaye. Well, I guess technically not Tanakama, because Abaye wouldn't be arguing with the Tanakama, but whether you're the first Amor, whether you're Abo, or whether you are Abaye, either you're going to be chayiv only twice. Because whether you're Abo, who says that Azorik bachutz is either a child of Shechutei bachutz or a child of Amayla bachutz, or if you're Abaye, who says that there's Amayla bachutz and there's everything else, if you do all three, basically Azorik is going to end up being lumped together with one of the other. So basically, if you do all three, you're going to be chayiv twice, not three times. Now we are going to be defining what is actually considered bachutz. What is considered that? Where are the locations that if you slaughter, a shochet b'mayla in those locations, you'll be chayiv kares 4. And we are now also going to explain the confusing pasuk which talks about asher yishchat b'machne or michutz lamachne. I don't understand. Is it michutz lamachne? Is it in the machne? So Be'etzim says the Gemara something that's very interesting in my opinion. Because we saw yesterday even, right, that when it says michutz lamachne, that means outside of all three camps, right? Param and Esrafim, Sirim and Esrafim, they're all burnt outside of all three camps. Para Aduma is burnt outside of all three camps. The Shefech Hadeshin is outside of all three camps. When it says michutz lamachne, generally we have a lot of precedent to say that michutz lamachne is outside of all three camps. So when it say, if it would just say by hashaychet bachutz, amayla bachutz, michutz lamachne, so then I might think outside of all three camps. So therefore it says ba'machane. No, it's in the camp. It's in the camp. It's not outside of all three camps. But if it only says ba'machane, what's ba'machane? Ba'machane shchina, in the Mishkan. So I might think if you slaughter, you can have Shechutei chutz in the Mishkan. How so? Well, a korban kachim, for example, needs to be slaughtered in the north of the Azara. Maybe if you slaughter in the Azara, but in the south of the Azara, that would be Shechutei chutz, and you'd be chayiv ba'machane. So therefore it has to say michutz lamachane. No, not in the Azara, outside of the Azara. So you need kind of both. Because if it just said michutz lamachne, I might think outside of all three camps. But if it says ba'machne, I might think in the Azar. So I need kilu to say michutz lamachne, but also ba'machne. Kilu outside of machne shchina, but still you'd be chayiv even in machne levia or certainly machne Yisrael. So says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, the Rebbe said michutz lamachne. When it says michutz lamachne, yachol chutz l'shalosh machnos, could it be outside of all three machnes, like we've seen the precedent by other like we've seen in other examples? So Talmud Omer, is b'machne. It says in the machne, not outside of the machne. Machne, if in the machne, so maybe it means in the azar you can have shchutei chutz. Yachol hashaychet ola badarim yechayev. What if a korban olav, which is kachim, and is meant to be slaughtered in the north of the azar? What if it was slaughtered in the south of the azar? Would that be shchutei chutz? Would you be chayev for that? Talmud Omer, skip the next two words. Michutz lamachne. Therefore it says no. It has to be outside of the azar. Machutz lamachne biyuchad she'ein roi l'shchitas kachim l'shchitas kol zevach. Just like michutz lamachne is a place where you're not allowed to slaughter any kind of korbanis. Yotza darim shavapi she'ein roi l'shchitas kachim or l'shchitas kachim kalim. But the south of the azara, even though sure kachim, you don't slaughter kachim there, you can't slaughter kachim kalim there. To be chayiv for shchutei chutz, we need a place where you're not allowed to slaughter any korbanos there at all. But you're not going to be chayiv for shchutei chutz in the azar. The Gemara now asks an interesting question. So it says, well, I guess not a question, but it's a machlekes. Says Ula that if somebody slaughters a korban on the roof of the heichol, is chayiv. Since you can't slaughter korbanos there. Interesting suggestion there. I imagine I just assumed that most people were thinking things the way I was thinking things. You take it outside of the azar and you slaughter it in the machne levia or something. Says Ula that you can even take a korban into the azar and climb up to the roof of the heichel and slaughter it there, and that would also be shchutei chutz, since you don't slaughter korbanos on the roof of the heichel. Maskif l'Rava, but Rava disagrees. Imkei nichtov kra b'machne michutz l'machne v'lo boy el pesach ha'amoid. See, the pasuk also says el pesach ha'amoid lo yavio, and Rava argues in this case, if you take a korban into the Azara and climb to the roof of the Heichel, that would not satisfy the criteria for Shechutei chutz of El Pesach Ol Moed Lo Hevio. To be chayiv for Shechutei chutz, it says that you didn't bring it to the Ol Moed. In this case, he did bring it to the Ol Moed. And then he climbed it, schlepped it to the roof of the Heichel, but he brought it to the Ol Moed. So therefore, Rava says you can't say that he's chayiv for Shechutei chutz. To be chayiv for Shechutei chutz, yeah, one of the criteria is Vel Ol Moed El Pesach Ol Moed Lo Hevio. Here he did bring it to the Ol Moed. So I'm came Niklav Krop. Where am I? Okay, fine. So according to Rava, it says El Pesach Al Moed to say that if somebody brings the korban to the roof of the Eichel, he's going to be potter. It will not be Shechutei chutz because after all, he brought it to the Al Moed. So according to Rava, then why not just have El Pesach Al Moed Lo Hevio? Let the pasuk just say, I don't need b'machne, michutz machne. That was confusing as it is. Just say that a person who has a korban, vel pesach ol moed lo hevio, and he didn't bring it to the ol moed. And basically anywhere outside of the ol moed, he'll be chayiv for shchutei chutz, and anywhere in the ol moed, even if it's on the roof of the eichel, he'll be potter for it. So lavli suye gago, the fact that we have b'machne and michutz machne to say that you're chayiv if you slaughter in a place where you're not allowed to slaughter it. So is that not coming? So is b'machne and michutz machne coming to say that even though you brought it el pesach al moed, but then you brought it to the top of the eichel, you'd be chayiv? Rav Mari lo. Mari says no. The isuye no. On top of the roof, you're potter like Rava says. The isuye kula b'fnim ve tzavar b'chutz. When it says it's coming to teach us that if you have an animal that was brought el ol moed, but only its body is inside the ol moed and its neck is outside of the ol moed, and then you slaughter the korban, you will be chayiv for that. Even though you brought it el pesach ol moed, you'll be chayiv for that because the neck was outside of the azar. Pshita, but that's obvious. Amai kapid rachmana. What is the Torah makbid on? Ashchita, v'shchita bachutzi. Well, you slaughter the neck was outside of the azar. Of course, you're going to be chayiv. No, turn it around. If the body is outside of the azara and the neck is inside the azara, you're still going to be chayiv for Shechutei chutz in that case, since the body was outside of the azara. Friends, and now we get to a very interesting topic. Itmar was stated on Maile Bizman Hazeh. What about nowadays? What if I were to go up to a sheep nowadays? So I live in Yerushalayim. I don't live in the old city. I live in Nachlaot. Let's say I go to Shuk Machne Yehuda. I don't think I could find a live sheep in Shuk Machne Yehuda. But let's say I could. Hillel Lester, what do you say? Do you think I could find a live sheep anywhere in Shuk Machne Yehuda? I don't think so. I've never seen it. But let's say I can go somewhere and find a live sheep. And I say, you're going to be a korban shlamim. And I slaughter it. And I make a mizbeach and I offer it. I just learn Masechta Zevachim. I'll do Shtaim Shein Arba. I'll do Zerikah. I guess I'll have to get a koy. No, by a bama. Even I could do it. I'll offer it on a bama. Will I be chayiv for Shechutei chutz? It's a very interesting question. And listen to what I think the answer might surprise you. It surprised me a little bit. Itma ma'ile b'zman hazeh. So ma'ile b'zman hazeh. Rabbi Yochanan Omar chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan says you would be chayiv. Rish Lakish Amar potter. Rish Lakish says potter. This, by the way, also herein lies, I believe. There's always those chevra on Erev Pesach that try to go to Har HaBayis to offer a korban Pesach. And I always wondered. I don't understand. There's no Beis HaMikdash. How could they offer? What are they doing? How could they offer a korban Pesach? There's no Beis HaMikdash. I don't understand. Here is the answer. I believe this is the answer. This Taka Machlaikis. I don't think it's so posh that everyone would agree with that they could bring a korban Pesach right now. But I think Lefi the Rambam, from my understanding, I looked at the Rambam. The Ravid. I looked quickly at the Ravid. I think the Ravid disagreed. The Ravid definitely disagrees with the Rambam. I'd have to look again at what exactly which Nakuda does he disagree with. But anyways, so let's see. So in Ma'amala B'zman Hazeh, somebody who offers a korban nowadays, Rabbi Yochanan says he would be chayiv for hamayla b'chutz. It says hamayla b'chutz. I imagine you should probably also be chayiv for ashaychit b'chutz. Rish Lakish Amar Potter. Rish Lakish says he would be potter for whatever. I'll say hamayla b'chutz. Okay. I assume that it's also ashaychit b'chutz. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan says chayiv because wait 1 second. Okay. My time in Nokan. Oh, interesting. So Tosfos Taka says, I just looked at it quickly. Okay, Tosfos says, okay, there's a. Okay, so you explain somewhere else why it doesn't mention Ashaychit B'chutz. And it was okay. So let's just go with Amayla B'chutz. We'll keep it not controversial. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayiv because Kiddush Rishon Kitchel L'Shad of Kitchel Asad Lavo. Rabbi Yochanan says, and the Rambam writes that when Shlomo HaMelech was Mekadesh Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash, that kedusha stayed even nowadays in 2025. The kedusha, I think the Rambam said, not just of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Makom Hamikdash, but also Yerushalayim. But that probably wouldn't be nachlaot there. And then I imagine it's probably the parts of Yerushalayim that Shlomo Melech was Mekadesh. But definitely, Har HaBayis for sure, that kedusha remained, and therefore, if the kedusha of Har HaBayis remains, technically, I this day, as we'll see in the Hemshech Gemara, technically speaking, the Rambam Paskins, technically speaking, if the Waqf for whatever the names allowed it, I can go, which I think explains why these people every Erev Pesach try to offer a korban Pesach on Har HaBayis. Technically speaking, kedusha rishon a kitchel l'shad of a kitchel asad level, the kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash remains. And even though there's no Beis Hamikdash now, the Kedusha is there, which means that I can still go there, and it is a place that I can offer in this respect to the Korban Pesach, but any Korban. And therefore, if I'm going to bring a Korban, I have to bring it to the Beis Hamikdash. And if I slaughter it outside of the Beis Hamikdash, it's Shechutei chutz. And I'll be chayiv for hamayla bachutz. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayiv because kedusha rishon kitchel l'shadav kitchel asad lava, that the initial kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash from Shlomo HaMelech is eternal. Rish Lakish Amar Potter. Rish Lakish says Potter because kedusha rishon kitchel l'shadav v'lo kitchel asad lava. Rish Lakish says Potter because the initial kedusha of Yerushalayim went away. Now Tosfos points out that there's questions to ask in Rish Lakish because there are other Mishnayos and other Makoros that say that you still can't, once there is the Beis Hamikdash is built, you can no longer offer private korbanos. What does it mean, potter? But anyways, let's not worry about that. Name of the beplukta Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua. Let's say that the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about kedusha rishon kitchel l'shayta v'kitchel asad lavo is like the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. The Tanan that we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer. So this is a Mishnah from Idias, and the Mishnah in Idias actually says Shamaiti kishayu boinu be'echol. So let's add that word Shamaiti because it's going to be relevant later on. So Shamaiti kishayu boinu be'echol. I heard that during the time of Ezra, when they came back to build the second temple, that when they were building the Heichel, hayu osin kloim be'echol kloim ba'azars, they would make sort of temporary walls, curtains, to demarcate where the Heichel was, where the Azara was, or where it was going to be. And in the Heichel, they would build while standing outside of these curtains. When they would be building the Azara, they would be standing in the Azara. Rabbi Yeshua says, I heard, you hear this? That you can offer korbanos, even though nowadays, there's no Beis Hamikdash, but it doesn't make a difference because Kedusha Rishon Kitchel, it's still holy. So I could bring a korban. I'm not a kohen, but I'll go with a kohen, and we can all, even nowadays, 2025, you can offer a korban on Har HaBayis. And if it's a korban chatas so then the kohanim can eat the kachei kachim, even though there's no demarcation of the Azara, but if you go to where the Azara should be, so Kohanim can eat kachim there. Kachim kalim ma'aser sheni, afal pi she'ein choma. And even though there's no wall around Yerushalayim anymore, you could still, I assume that, I assume it's not talking about the wall that was built, I think it was built by the Ottomans, the current wall of the old city, I believe. Anyways, but, the Kedusha of Yerushalayim, so that's what the Rambam was saying about the Kedusha of Yerushalayim, right? The Kedusha of Yerushalayim of Shlomo HaMelech remains, and you can eat Meiser Sheni, you can eat Kachim Kalim, anywhere that was demarcated by Shlomo HaMelech to be Yerushalayim. Because the initial Kedusha of Yerushalayim is eternal. And the Rambam passes this way. You can look up the Rambam. See it for yourselves. It's givaldic. It's eye-opening. From the fact that Yoshua makes it clear that Kedusha Rishona Kitchel L'Shaita, the Kitchel L'Shaita, that's Rabbi Yoshua's opinion. Does that not mean that Rabbi Eliezer, who argues, or who seemingly argues, who we want to say argues, with that not, so we should say that Rabbi Eliezer holds Kedusha Rishona Kitchel L'Shaita v'lo Kitchel L'Shaita. It's not eternal. Lo Kitchel. Some of the Ravina Ravashi says Ravina Ravashi, not necessarily Mimai. How come? That's the assumption. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer also agrees that the Kedusha of Yerushalayim is eternal. Umar my deshmir leikamer, Umar my deshmir leikamer. That's why I pointed out that in the Mishnah in Eidos, Rabbi Eliezer also says Shemaiti, I heard. So it could be that they both agree, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua agree, Kedusha Rishona Kitchel L'Shaitim Kitchel L'Shaita, simply that Rabbi Eliezer was saying Shemaiti about the curtains, and Rabbi Yeshua was saying Shemaiti about that you can offer the korbanos nowadays. Kilu, they were just saying what they heard, but they don't necessarily have an argument about whether Kedusha Rishona Kitchel L'Shaitim Kitchel L'Shaita or not. According to Rabbi Eliezer, why did we need those curtains? It's news about just for tzniut, just for to have some privacy, to be able to demarcate different spaces, so it's not just one huge open area. Itmar was stated, Hamayla ve'emo kazayis betzem hashlimo lekazayis. If a person is offering a hamayla bachutz probably, and there isn't, a kazayis, the limb itself that you're offering isn't a kazayis, but the bone that's there makes it a kazayis. Rabbi Yochanan Amar says Rabbi Yochanan chayav, they'd be chayav for, I imagine we're talking about a ma'ila bachutz. And Rish Lakish Amar Potter, Rish Lakish says Potter, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayiv. The reason why Rabbi Yochanan says Chayiv is because Chibure Olin, Ko'olin Dami, anything connected to whatever you're putting on the Mizbeach is considered part of what you are putting on the Mizbeach, and if the bone is going to make it a kazayis, so be it, and you'll be Chayiv. Rish Lakish Amar Potter, Rish Lakish says Potter, Chibure Olin Lav, Ko'olin Dami, because that which is connected is not going to be, just because the bone's connected to the meat doesn't mean that we're going to count the bone. But Rava Asa, Maile Rosh Shoyona, Veimbo Kazayis, if a person is Maile Bachutz, the head of a dove, and there's no Kazayis in the head of the dove, Melach, Mashtimul Kazayis, but you put on some salt, and now it's a Kazayis Mal, what's the halacha? Amalei, Rabbi Parzakular of Ashi Lav, Ainu Plukta Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Is this not the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish? Rabbi Yochanan would say Chai, Rish Lakish would say Potter. Tibai Rabbi Yochanan, Tibai Rish Lakish, not necessarily. Tibai Rabbi Yochanan, you could ask and say regarding Rabbi Yochanan, Adkan Lokam Rabbi Yochanan Hosam Ele Etzem Demino de Bosaru. I could say that, look, Rabbi Yochanan says you can count the bone as part of what's being offered because it's part of the animal itself. But the salt, which is not part of the animal, it's not part of the bird, maybe Rabbi Yochanan would say, cannot be counted. And Tibai, the Rish Lakish, Adkan lo kam Rish Lakish also, ele etzem the iparish mina lo lav mitzvah le'asuke. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan, maybe Rish Lakish says we don't count the bone, since if the bone comes off the mizbeach, you don't have to put it back on. Aval hacha the iparish mitzvah le'asuke. But if the salt comes off, you'd have to add more salt. Maybe Rish Lakish would say that you would be chayiv. Odim loshna. Maybe it makes a difference. You would say potter teku. Let's go weiter. But friends, we are only going to go weiter tomorrow. That was Daf Kuf Zayin of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, we are getting close to the finish mark. We're getting close to Daf Kuf Chaf of Masechta Zevachim. This is unbelievable. I think finally we can see that the end of Masechta Zevachim, not that we want to get rid of Masechta Zevachim, but we are so exciting that we are coming to the completion, let's say, of Masechta Zevachim coming up pretty soon. Friends, on Daf Kuf Zayin of Masechta Zevachim, we learned about offering Shechutei chutz, bachutz. Right? If you the Chachamim had said in our Mishnah that if an animal was slaughtered outside of the Azara and then offered outside of the Azara, you are chayiv for that. We saw 3 opinions as to why that is. Kahana had learned it out from the word ve'aleim to want to say that it's saying that about the Shechutei chutz, you'll also be chayiv for Ma'ale bachutz. Rava says no, it's not aleim with an ayin, it's aleim with an aleph. It's talking about Bnei Yisrael. Rather, Rava learns out from Rabbi Yishmael, Tanit Rabbi Yishmael, that it says ve'aleim. The vav is connecting the Shechutei chutz and the Ma'ale bachutz to say that it's you'll be chayiv for offering that which was slaughtered bachutz. Rabbi Yochanan learned out from Gzeira Shava, to which we asked, right, ava between ashaychet bachutz and Ma'ale bachutz, to which we asked, wait, but then we have a problem with the Mishnah, the first Mishnah in Kresis, which lists 36 things that your chayiv cars for, not 37. We then discussed Zerikah bachutz. Not only were you chayiv for shchita bachutz and a Ma'ale bachutz, but also hazorek bachutz you would be chayiv for as well. Rabbi Shmuel learns it out from Dam Yechoshev, which is a pasuk by Shechet bachutz. Rabbi Kiva learns it out from O Zavach, which is a pasuk by Hamayle bachutz. We asked, would you be chayiv for Kemitzah bachutz or kabbalah bachutz? The answer is no, you won't. We defined what is considered bachutz. What are the places that if you slaughter or armayle, Shechet bachutz, armayle bachutz, what is bachutz? Outside of the Azara is bachutz. Within the 3 camps, you don't have to take it outside of the 3 camps. Even just anywhere outside the Azara is ashaychet bachutz. Ula says even the roof of the Azara would be considered ashaychet bachutz. Rava disagreed. And finally, we said Shechutei chutz nowadays, bizman hazeh. I thought there was a very, very interesting discussion there. Machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says because kedusha rishona kitchel shata v'kitchel asid lavo. Therefore, right now, technically, you could offer a korban on Har HaBayis, and therefore, if you offer a korban outside of Har HaBayis, so you'll be chayiv for, or even outside of where the Azara should be, you'd be chayiv for Shechutei chutz. Rish Lakish says pater because kedusha rishona kitchel shata v'lo kitchel asid lavo. That was a very interesting discussion with very interesting insights into actually things that we could be doing nowadays. Technically, you can, which now I think maybe I understand that basis for why people every Erev Pesach try to offer a korban Pesach. Technically, according to this, I imagine it's a machlokes. I imagine it's not so pashut. But according to this, it sounds like maybe they're going based on this to say that nowadays you can offer the korban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. Friends, that was Daf Kuf Zayin of Masechta Zevachim. Hope you enjoyed. Have a good one. Cheers.